Okay, we're back. We're live. We're here. We're here with a kind of a special show today. You'll notice that the lady on my far left is Jiang. She's normally the host of ThinkTech Asia on Tuesdays, and you'll notice the guy in the middle is Michael Davis, and he's like from Hong Kong. He's a scholar, a law professor, and a journalist. Is that a fair statement of it?
Well, I write media commentary from time to time.
That's good enough for me. And
a public intellectual, perhaps.
Okay, public intellectual.
There you go.
That's what we will refer to you as. So we're doing a kind of a special thing because you're here as a visiting scholar, and you just did a talk at the East-West Center yesterday. And you wrote an article that appeared as a commentary in the New York Times recently, all about the subject of China and Hong Kong, the political crisis in Hong Kong, if you will. And we've entitled it provocatively, "Should China be meddling in Hong Kong?" Because that's what I think it's doing. Okay, Welcome to the show, Michael.
Oh, thank you.
And Hong, is how nice to have you here now.
It's good for me to sit over here.
Yeah, relax. Yeah,
That's right. Yeah.
Be on the hot seat.
I look forward to learning from you about Hong Kong and what's happening there.
Okay, thank you.
So, Michael, you are a graduate of the John A. Burns. The William S. Richardson School of Law.
No, I'm not.
Oh, you're not.
They got that wrong.
Okay, all right. But
I'm so close to John Van Dyke, they thought I was his student.
Okay.
Even his wife, Sherry, thought I was his student. But I am John's student in a sense that I
Okay.
follow in his work and so
Okay.
on. But I went to the Hastings College of the Law and to the Yale Law School. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll find out the difference today.
That's right. We'll sort this out. My resume.
Now, how did you get to Hong Kong? That's probably an interesting story.
Well, I was here in Hawaii. I worked for Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation. I'm working on Native Hawaiian rights cases. I was active in the environmental issues here and so on. And I was teaching at night at the University of Hawaii and kind of thought, okay, I like my night job better than my day job. And so I was looking for an academic appointment, and I found one in Hong Kong, thinking it was perhaps a couple years, but it's now more than 20.
So in 10 words or less, how has it been?
It's very good. That's what keeps me there. There's so much going on there. It's like Hong Kong is this little pivot on China itself and the rest of Asia. It's probably the hot middle point of Asia, and so much that passes through there. And as a scholar and a public intellectual, it's just endless ways I can contribute. So I feel very gratified that I can just contribute to the society.
So where are you teaching, and what are you teaching?
I teach at the University of Hong Kong in a program in international human rights. So I have students from really all over, a lot of students from China doing masters in human rights. I have students from Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Myanmar, you name it. And so they all sit around a table, every week and discuss really important issues for the region.
Is it a free discussion? I mean, you don't have any limits on your ability to say things?
No limits. The limits are over the border, not in Hong Kong.
Can we talk about that?
So we can talk about whatever we want.
So you've been there in the critical period since it got turned back.
Oh, yes.
You've seen it all. I mean, it's an irresistible thing to consider and examine and watch it evolve. And you can see the sea changes, which has led you to write about this, and you've written a lot about it, eh?
Yeah, I write all the time. I think what happens when you're writing about something that's past, then you write books or lengthy articles. When you're writing about something that's unfolding every day, when you wake up in the morning, you have to check what's the latest. Then you write media commentary, and I do a lot of interviews like this one, CNN, you name it, CBS, whatever, any news organization. Because when something's unfolding, if you want to contribute to the discussion, you have to really go out in that way. I mean, I testify in the U.S. Congress or in the Legislative Council in Hong Kong. So these are ways to contribute to that discussion.
So what emerges out of this is that you're not only an observer, you're not only a public intellectual, observing, you're actually involved in the process. You're having an effect on the sea change.
Well, it's interesting that people, and this is, I think, a lesson for any law students or other graduate students that are watching, that you can have an effect on things. I mean, you have to really put one foot in front of the other and get involved. In 2003, we wanted to stop national security laws from being passed. They were passed under something called Article 23 in Hong Kong, which said that Hong Kong was supposed to enact these laws. Except the laws the Beijing pushed them into enacting would diminish people's rights protection. So 9 lawyers, we sat in a room like this in a circle and decided to write a bunch of pamphlets, just one-page pamphlets, different colors, explaining why these laws that were being proposed were inadequate and why they threatened human rights, free speech in Hong Kong. We took these out onto the street. We had photocopies made of them, distributed 500,000 on the street. You know, a month later, we had 500,000 people on the street demonstrating against those laws. And eventually the government was forced to withdraw the laws, and they've never been enacted since. In that process, the Secretary for Security resigned, and a year later, the Chief Executive resigned. So, I mean, this is ordinary, well, not ordinary, they were leading members of the bar.
None of this is ordinary, Michael.
Right, they're leading members of the bar. A couple of us academics pitching in because they thought we were half smart, and so we had something to add to the discussion. And they take this to the public. So this happens a lot in Hong Kong. Right now, there's a group called Occupy Central that's trying to stop China from putting in place a kind of universal suffrage that looks like Iran, where you vet the candidates and then people can vote for them. And so Occupy Central has threatened to occupy Central, the financial district of Hong Kong, with 10,000 people all sitting down if China...
That'll make an impression.
Yeah, if China doesn't have proposals that meet international standards. So this, again, is one of those 3 guys leading Occupy Central is my colleague on the law faculty. Another was my former colleague in the other university where I used to teach. So these people are, again, very ordinary kind of professors, people that just want to take an interest in these kinds of issues, and they step up and do something. Not unlike what, you know, the Hawaiian independence movement here, what people do under these issues.
I was going to ask you, I mean, just before we get into the detail of it, did you ever imagine that you'd be in the center of things when you left for Hong Kong?
I guess I did, because I tend to spend most of my life in the center of things. I mean, I'm a human rights lawyer. That's sort of my job. I remember one of the university vice presidents in Hong Kong, he's called a vice chancellor, pro-vice chancellor, told me, he says, you know, academics should stay out of public affairs. And I says, well, that's nice for you. You're a physics professor, but I'm a human rights professor. What am I supposed to do? Not contribute to the public debate.
It's just another iteration of publish or perish.
That's right, exactly. So in this case, you publish, then you perish.
Well, you know, so this all sort of centers around a commentary that you wrote, an op-ed piece, I guess you'd say, that you wrote for the New York Times, which was very well received and which has had a lot of buzz around it, as well as various other pieces for the China Morning Post as well.
South China Morning Post, another piece for the New York Times is, you know, a Q&A.
Yeah.
But these are channels to sort of draw attention to an issue. It's not bullying anybody, it's putting information out and letting people themselves think about it.
Well, Hong Jiang has studied you, and I mean on an intellectual level.
Learn from you, because I've been paying attention to human rights issues in China and in related issues like Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And there's definitely, you know, all these happenings, especially now. Yeah. So maybe we can have you talk a little bit about what is the key issue that's happening right now in Hong Kong. There are these 2 different protests that's going on. Tell us more about it.
Yeah, what's going on is under the, number one, to think about it, Hong Kong is under a model called One Country, Two Systems. So this was an agreement that was reached between the British and the Chinese called the Sino-British Joint Declaration in 1984, which was to provide for the return of Hong Kong to China. But as Deng Xiaoping said in 1983 or 82, I forget the year, he said Hong Kong people should put their hearts at ease. We're not going to trash Hong Kong. We're not going to overthrow the system. You can maintain this system, they said, for 50 years. And since then, he even, on one occasion or 2, said that maybe even beyond 50 years. If it works, you know, why destroy it? So this promise and then this agreement is the basis for, I think, as the handover approach for renewed confidence in Hong Kong. And under that agreement, there's a basic law. And the basic law is provided for in that Sino-British treaty. And in effect, the treaty stipulates the content of the basic law. One of the things in the basic law actually promises the rule of law, human rights, very liberal group of human rights, and that Hong Kong people would rule Hong Kong through democratic elections. And the basic law is very specific because at the handover, a lot of the members of the Legislative Council and the chief executive were essentially appointed. So it was very specific that the ultimate aim is universal suffrage in electing the chief executive upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures. All of this fighting is over that sentence. Okay, the fear is that, what is a nominating committee? I mean, America doesn't have a nominating committee, we have parties. Most countries in the world elect their leader through parties. So it's very unique to have a single committee, an official body, set up to nominate the candidates on both sides of an election. So
They control the slate, though.
Right, they can control the slate. So if you want to have universal suffrage is not an infinitely flexible term. It does mean that people have a free choice. We have a lot of literature on that. It's guaranteed under the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights that people would have this right to vote, and in rough equality in voting, you know, that not one voter is more powerful than another, and so on, and access to the voting, you know, booth and so on. So this universal suffrage, so they said the ultimate aim is universal suffrage. Hong Kong people take that seriously. You say universal suffrage, we want universal suffrage. We don't want a version of universal suffrage that says everyone can vote for somebody picked by the Communist Party. Of course, communist countries used to claim 90-some% voting. Everybody voted, but that's not universal suffrage.
Can I reel this back and suggest, Hong Kong, that you ask Michael why Deng Xiaoping
Yeah.
did that in the first place? What political vectors made him do that? Did he have to? He didn't have to do it.
Well, I think you have to look at him.
Let her ask the question.
Oh, okay.
Well, you asked.
You asked the
no.
question already.
I'm trying to be fair about that.
Yeah, well, I think the key is, China at the time, in order to bring Hong Kong back, had to make some concessions and make some promises. I think that was also setting an example for taking back Taiwan in the long run.
They were trying to do that.
Yeah, so therefore, it make it look good in the national in the international community. Except that the Communist Party just can't help itself.
Right. See, this is the thing. Destroying Hong Kong would be really a big loss of face for China. And Deng Xiaoping, as we know, was quite an inventive leader. He was moving towards reform in China. There were limits
Capitalism, all
to, yeah,
that.
there were limits to his reform agenda, but at least it was rather dramatic at the time in the late 1980s. And so he's very open to what he can do to preserve Hong Kong. I remember at one point I asked the very first class I ever had in Hong Kong, after this joint declaration was signed, I said, well, what would you have done? And after a big discussion, they all voted. It was really laughable almost. There was no experience with democracy in Hong Kong at the time, so they said, oh, well, we would have the Chinese government, British government return Hong Kong to China, but then China would hire the British to run it. so the
ultimate outsourcing.
Right. The culture of Hong Kong at the time was so apolitical. People just didn't know how to engage in
Just
politics.
business.
But now what's happened, if I asked that question, this answer would be laughed out of the room. The most active groups on Hong Kong streets today are those students. Even the high school students are involved. A group called Scholarism has been very active in this debate.
Scholarism.
And the Scholarism group are 15 to 17-year-olds. So nowadays the youth would not have this kind of cop-out. But you can see in the answer they gave back then, they clearly did not trust China. I mean, that was the bottom line. And the Chinese leaders knew it, and Deng Xiaoping knew it. So he wanted to set up something that had a security built into it. And this was to have a treaty with the British that guaranteed all these things. And this is why Hong Kong people stopped fleeing Hong Kong. At the time, they were all fleeing to get passports overseas. But this agreement, an international treaty, and then very solemn guarantees in the basic law, telling Hong Kong people to put their hearts at ease. They took this Sino-British joint declaration to all the capitals of the world, and they asked governments around the world to rely on this one country, two systems model.
Diplomatic relations.
And treat Hong Kong differently. To treat Hong Kong, not have the same restrictions and so on regarding trade, because in those days China was still very much communist.
It's got to be one of the most interesting phenomenon of our times.
Right, it is. And so this is why people have confidence in it, and today why things coming out of Beijing cause people to be a bit concerned, because now it used to be put your hearts at ease. Now it's the message from Beijing seems to be Beijing is the boss.
Well, but you know, that
So
was, let me
big-
offer the thought, and we can discuss this after the break.
Yeah,
That was inevitable.
Yes.
It was only a matter of time.
there you go.
Okay, that's Michael C. Davis, a scholar, a law professor, and a public intellectual, okay, in Hong Kong, visiting Hawaii. This is ThinkTech Asia, where me and Hung Jiang are interrogating him appropriately about his articles that he's been writing. We're asking, should China be meddling in Hong Kong, which some people feel it is doing. We'll be right back after this break.
Aloha, my name is Willow Chang Elion, and I host a show called The Art of Life. We air live every Friday from 2 to 3 p.m. And what we do is basically we focus on individuals who create a unique sense of place for Hawaii. These are movers and shakers, artists, innovators. They are also traditionalists. They're all involved in the archival process, and they make this place a unique place, one that makes Hawaii a richer place to be. I hope you do join us, and certainly tell your friends about the show, whether they live here or they live abroad. It's a way to give back to our community. We're keeping it Pono.
We're back. We're live. I'm Jay Fidell. This is ThinkTech Asia. I'm here with Hung Jiang. We're co-hosts today. And our guest is Michael C. Davis. He's a scholar, law professor, and public intellectual in Hong Kong. Teaches law and generally gets involved.
Yeah.
You're involved
Yes,
in
I
Hong
do
Kong.
occasionally.
Should China be meddling in Hong Kong? That's what's happening these days. So again, welcome to the show, Michael.
Thank you.
Hung, why don't you ask about the articles that have appeared?
So maybe to try to understand more of what's happening now, maybe you can tell us more about this Occupy Central that seems to be kind of gathering all of these discontent.
Right, and it has. And it's interesting because my colleague Benny Tai had, like me, had written commentary. He's written a commentary in one of the newspapers where he suggested there might be something like this to pressure Beijing on democracy. And I don't think he quite imagined that he was going to be doing it right away. But sort of the idea caught on, and I think he was sort of propelled into it. He's not a radical by any stretch. In fact, he is happy always to tell me I'm more radical than he is. But in any event, this promise of occupying Central, they're using this nonviolent strategies. They've read the literature, drank the tea on nonviolence. We've seen similar nonviolent struggles in the former Yugoslavia. We've seen it in Egypt, before recent events, and so on. So there's a kind of experience around the world on using these strategies. And so this is what they're trying to do. So he had a number of public consultations. He eventually had a public referendum. And the public referendum, at first I think there weren't, a lot of people thought he was a bit too radical. Hong Kong people are rather cautious lot. So at first there weren't too, I think his support wasn't great. And the guess was that his public referendum might get 100,000 participants. Unfortunately, Beijing had a very untimely white paper on Hong Kong that scared the hell out of everyone. And after that, he had 800,000 people voting in his civil referendum. So it went ballistic. And then a week or so later, he had 500,000 in a public demonstration on July 1st, which is the anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong. Now she's asked the question also about on the other side. Well, Beijing doesn't sit around nowadays and just go out and send the PLA and arrest people, especially in Hong Kong. It won't do that. So what it does instead is it mobilizes on the other side. So there's this a bunch of pro-Beijing people who have created the anti-Occupy Central group, and they spend a month collecting signatures and claim to have 1.46 million signatures, although they've not been willing to show the forms that people sign. But anyhow, they claim this. We don't know who's all involved. And then they had demonstration this past weekend. And it was interesting. They claimed 193,000 people showed up for their demonstration. They had asked academics to measure the crowd, and the academics came up with 80,000, 79 to 88,000. But then the police also weighed in and said there was 111,000. Now, whenever the Democrats demonstrate in Hong Kong, the police usually cut in half what the academics said. In this case, they almost doubled what the academics
that
said.
whole dynamic is really fascinating. On the one hand, the whole kind of a democratic movement in Hong Kong seems to be really stepping up.
Right.
You know, this
Oh,
Occupy
yes.
Central is a new strategy
Right.
that you know, you see in other Western
Right.
countries, and this is the first time in Hong Kong.
Right.
At the same time, the Chinese government is playing these kind of strategy.
Oh, yes.
Hey, we're having a kind of a people's movement as well.
Right.
And people have spoken.
Right, exactly.
And for two people outside, a couple questions. Why would Hong Kong police? I know it has to do with the influence from Beijing. Why would the Hong Kong police stand on the side of Beijing? And the other thing is that how was this anti-Occupy Central movement organized?
Well, the organization of it is somewhat opaque in many respects, because it's hard to know when it comes to leftists in Hong Kong. They don't actually, put out signs and newspaper ads on who they are. So it's always been a mystery in Hong Kong how much the Communist Party controls the leftist camp. There's been a few books on it, but nobody really knows. So that's like a $50 million question. How active is the Communist Party in Hong Kong? It's not supposed to be there. It's in effect illegal, but we all know it's there. And where the Beijing government's offices are is in the Western District. So whenever anything happens in Hong Kong today, everyone sort of says, that must be coming from the Western District. That's code. That's code for Beijing. So this kind of meddling in Hong Kong affairs through sort of secretly through the people and mass movements is rather opaque. But one thing that was noticeable in the demonstration, and again, there's a kind of cynical reporting going on. So the reports said that buses were coming from the mainland to bring demonstrators.
To bring people, yeah.
So I don't know if this is true or not. I wasn't one of the reporters.
One thing I was reading just yesterday, that this pro-China movement was organized by some work units. They actually promote, send the buses, and also gave bonuses.
Right, and there's allegations that all the restaurants, because they want to count the demonstrators as they leave Victoria Park. So you can leave Victoria Park and then go to a restaurant and have dim sum. It wouldn't, because you would still be counted. So all of these things, I'm not saying that everyone was doing that, because I have to assume that 193,000 or 100,000 or 80,000 has some people who are very serious about the view. They may think that this Occupy Central threatens the peace and order in Hong Kong, and that's not the way to go. It's not the way to bring about democracy. But then there's all these cynical reports, and the reports themselves then become the news, because it shows you how cynical Hong Kong people are about this and what they think is going on. And what is actually going on is not always clear.
And that's making the whole issue more difficult for people to decipher.
Right.
And on the one hand, you have had the Chinese government meddling in Hong Kong, increasing influence in Hong Kong. And you also see, as they move more people into Hong Kong is becoming a different place.
Oh yeah, and a lot of Hong Kong people are responding with a kind of disgust. Of course, some of them are almost racist, calling mainlanders locusts and things like this. Other demonstrators have carried British flags, and then there's been big uproars when mainlanders unfortunately let their little ones drop their drawers and pee on the street or something, and then the accusations that they don't respect Hong Kong customs and traditions. I remember as a young guy here in Hawaii, when we first started getting busloads of Japanese tourists, we also kind of reacted, oh, these guys pull up in the bus, they all get out, take a camera shot, and then get back on the bus and go. I think when you have a lot of tourists, that already generates a little bit of blowback. But what's going on in Hong Kong is, I think it's more than that. I think the people see mainland officials, because the mainland officials represent things that just aren't believable. You know, the way they talk about Hong Kong and what they're going to do, their promises made, and that, oh, we're upholding the basic law. Nobody in Hong Kong believes they're upholding the basic law.
I know, the Chinese people wouldn't believe them either.
No one believes it. And yet, they're claiming they're upholding the basic law, and the people on the other side are violating it. And so this causes a huge amount of distrust. And then you have things going on. We see a kind of emerging crony capitalism going on because mainlanders are so important in public policy and influencing public policy. Then, of course, capitalists,
That's my next question.
play up to these guys.
in terms of buy-offs.
Right. Hong
Yeah.
Kong people feel like the free, Hong Kong was famous for being the least corrupt place on earth, practically. And so there's a feeling like this is being eroded. Even our last chief executive was known to have friends across the border and had got a sweetheart deal in buying a fancy house after his retirement and so on. So all of this kind of, even the head of the corruption agency, which is one of the most respected anti-corruption bodies in the world, is now being investigated for corruption. So I still think Hong Kong is not very corrupt. I think we have a lot of honest civil servants, and we have a very strong rule of law. We have a free press. But people feel there's a creeping erosion of this.
Isn't there?
I guess there is.
The mainland Chinese, Beijing is determined to have it its way,
Right,
and it has the power of time.
right,
So it can put immigrants in.
right,
It can erode all that anti-corruption.
right,
It can erode everything it wants over time.
right.
And its play, it seems to me, see if you agree, is just keep a lid on things, keep the tumultuousness down,
Right.
and we'll wait this out. And over time, we'll have it the way exactly that we want.
Right, and I think you're right, and I think this is what people worry about. When you look at this white paper they just issued, originally the deal was Hong Kong people, put your hearts at ease because we got an international treaty, solemn obligation, a basic law, constitution guaranteeing the rule of law. Your common law judges will continue to do their work, and the judges in Hong Kong are the most respected people in Hong Kong. All of this will be carried on, and now we get a white paper that says people have a lopsided view of one country, two systems. They use the word lopsided. And that this lopsided view, they fail to understand that this is about the security of China. One country, two systems is about China. It's not about preserving Hong Kong. It's about China's interest. And we have the ultimate authority. And then they actually argue that all the language of the Sino-British Joint Declaration was actually created by them 2 years earlier. They call it the 12 Principles. It's 12 articles in that treaty. They call it the 12 Principles. Now, anybody can believe if they want that Chinese government in 1983 wrote a bunch of human rights principles down and was going to implement them. But that's what they're claiming. So what they've done, in effect, is said it's not about the Joint Declaration anymore. It's our policy. We can amend and interpret the basic law any way we want. And they're very explicit in the white paper.
So what
on
does that mean?
Essentially means that they're the
In terms
boss.
of their own, yeah,
That's
right.
it.
I mean, so the mask is off.
Right. Up until now, a large, they've had a few decisions over the years that people felt very uneasy about. But then they kind of recognize, we better be careful. And so they back off, and Hong Kong has gone on. All this erosion and capitalism things I've been talking about, setting them aside a minute, for the most part, Hong Kong goes on as it always has. But now it seems, this is not going to be the case. Now, we don't know whether this white paper is just smoke and no action, whether our blowback will cause them to be more cautious. But I think Hong Kong people have been educated to the point that if you don't stand up and fight for your rights, you're not going to have them. And so this is one very good thing. And I think this is actually the last British governor, Chris Patten, he understood that most of the things, he proposed a lot of things, and China called him the greatest sinner of 5,000 years and all this stuff. But one thing he knew was you had to take these issues out of back rooms and put them in the public arena. And that this was going to teach Hong Kong people to defend their rights when the British were long gone.
Why does it sound like Hawaii?
It does, I can tell you. I used to be active in these issues here as well.
Let's take a break.
I know something about them.
That's Michael C. Davis. He's a scholar, a law professor, and a public intellectual in Hong Kong. He spent a lot of time in Hawaii. He's visiting Hawaii now, just spoke at the East-West Center. The question before the House is, should China be meddling in Hong Kong? And my co-host is Hung Jiang, and we'll be right back after this break.
Hello, I'm Martin Despang, and I'm the host together with the one and only Ali Yamashita, and our show is called Urban Transcendence. And Urban Transcendence is about identifying where we have a unique situation of a vibrant city in one of the most beautiful natural environments. So how these two can coincide, sometimes conflict, how they could find reciprocity in the 21st century is what we're excited about. And we're planning on bringing in a diverse body of guests, both from the arts and the science and the established and the wise and the emerging generation. So hope you will join us. We'll always be on Thursdays from 1 to 2 p.m.
The floor
Okay.
here in front of everyone.
Okay, we're back. We're live. We're having a great time. You know, you wish you were here during the breaks. The breaks is where the real meat is. My co-host is Hung Jiang. This is ThinkTech Asia. We're talking about China. Should China be meddling in Hong Kong? With Michael C. Davis, who is a scholar, law professor, and public intellectual in Hong Kong. And we are happy to have him today. He's a special guest. And we're talking about what's going on in Hong Kong. Take it away, Hung Jiang.
Thinking about Hong Kong's future, looking at this infiltration of the Chinese power, not just direct infiltration, but also you talk about how the Chinese side also talk about the law, but then on the at the back they're doing something totally different.
Right.
So how is Hong Kong society has changed, and where is it going?
Well, you know, I think Hong Kong people are very resilient. So through various crises like SARS in the past and everything, at the same time as SARS, there were proposals for national security laws that engaged a lot of public protest and so on. But Hong Kong keeps going on. So I think they've learned politics.
Yeah.
We don't know, what we don't know is what Beijing will do this time. I think Hong Kong people are going, if Beijing comes up with proposals that amount to what people in Hong Kong call fake democracy, then there's going to be protest on the streets. And I don't know whether Beijing will get strong-handed this time. And that's why I think, I think things we talked about during the break, that's why this bears a lot of watching by the world.
Yeah.
Because if you do have heavy-handedness going on there, and everyone is invested because Hong Kong is treated as a separate system for international trade and commerce, cultural exchanges, you name it. And so at this point, people will certainly want to assert, their interest in Hong Kong. I don't know how many tens of thousands of Americans there. There's people from the European continent, Japan, different countries. So people do have an interest in Hong Kong, and I think most of us morally have an interest in having a society be preserved and protected.
Hong Kong is a very unique place. I visited Hong Kong once in 2006. In my observation, I see Hong Kong as people being more aware and freer than even the U.S. vis-a-vis the Chinese politics.
Yeah.
They are more open, more willing to speak up. Probably because of the long history of Hong Kong being the outpost of whatever information that would be coming out of China, even during the Cold War period.
And I think there's very clear structural reasons. When you have the rule of law, you have basic rights protection, you have international human rights commitments that are enforced. In the United States, the U.S. signs the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but then when it passes it through Congress and ratifies, has a reservation that says it can't be enforced locally in the United States, right? In Hong Kong, the ICCPR is incorporated into the Bill of Rights of Hong Kong and the Basic Law of Hong Kong. And so people laws, anything that government does cannot violate that covenant. So they have a very strong tradition of human rights, very robust tradition of the rule of law, very poor tradition of democracy. And that's why the fight over this issue of electing the chief executive and the promise of universal suffrage. That's the last plank in having a full constitutional system. Now, is this significant in China, or is it a threat to China? I don't think it's a threat. I think China itself faces a future where it has to come to grips with political reform. And I think they understand Hong Kong as a laboratory in some sense for understanding how to do this. But they also have a mindset that makes it very difficult for them to let go. They want to control everything.
On the surface, it doesn't make sense for the Chinese government to make so much of demands and control over Hong Kong. But What do you think is the motive of the
Well,
control?
they have so much control on the mainland that I think they psychologically believe that the answer to any kind of disturbance or disorder
Okay.
is control. But if you have a free society like Hong Kong, trying to do that may actually cause the disturbance or disorder. They don't quite get this yet, that if you just let the thing develop normally as promised in the basic law, chances are it'll be very peaceful. Hong Kong
That's
people
right,
are
yeah.
pragmatic.
Yeah.
They don't want to fight political battles.
What you said before about it being a laboratory is kind of interesting.
Right.
It's a laboratory for becoming enlightened, or possibly a laboratory for control. And I
Right.
think mainland may see Hong Kong as a whole experiment on trying to squash this stuff instead of allowing
A
it.
better way of putting it is how to manage democracy
Fine.
rather than squash
that's
it.
that's
They like
interesting.
their
Okay.
idea is, oh, we want to go towards democracy, and maybe in the mainland we claim to have or want to have democracy. But one British official long ago said the Chinese leaders don't mind having elections as long as they know the outcome ahead of time.
Now there's democracy.
My daughter just worked over here on the Shots campaign this summer as an intern,
did you?
and that battle wouldn't be one that they would appreciate too much. But this is the, I think it's a learning process. The Chinese leaders have done a lot of good things in the last couple decades as they liberalize their system. But now they face a lot of challenges, and Hong Kong is just one of these challenges. But this is I think it's one where they can learn a lot if they're willing to.
Don't you see a risk here? I mean, we saw Ukraine, it all seemed fairly civilized.
Right.
All of a sudden there were boots on the ground and planes being shot out of the air, lots of killing. Okay, and there's other circumstances around. I mean, I thought Ferguson was going to be over in a few hours, and it's
Yeah.
been 10 days.
Right.
We live in strange times, which cover the globe. Isn't it possible that what seems like a peaceful demonstration could turn violent?
Well, this
anytime.
And this is where I think again the government has more control in a sense than the demonstrators. If they send out provocateurs like they have with this organizing an anti-Occupy movement, and then it starts looking like Bangkok with people on two sides of a very contentious issue. On the other hand, quite frankly, if they make some moderate proposals and people still want to occupy Central, if they just let them occupy Central, maybe send in bagels for them to eat or something, and just let them there a while, actually they get bored. If there's no contention on the other side, a lot of times, well, look at Occupy Wall Street. It died of its own steam.
Could be the bagels.
Well, we'll call it char siu bao, maybe.
You
in
heard
this
you
case.
heard it here on ThinkTech.
So did char siu bao instead of bagels. I just bought 5 dozen bagels to take back to Hong Kong.
Of course you did.
But in terms of where the mainland politics is moving and its impact on Hong Kong, what do you predict?
Well, the current leader has moved things backwards in a lot of ways. He seems to have some aspirations to be a strongman leader, Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
In many ways, just the harassment of mainland human rights defenders and suppression of ethnic minorities, the problems in Xinjiang, in many ways he's taken a tougher line, and it tends to prove what I just said. And the United States learned this lesson in Iraq in many ways. If you go in and bully people, sometimes you actually enable them to mobilize, and you create more contention. When you claim you're trying to suppress it and control it, you're actually creating it. I mean, push somebody and they will fight back. And this is what I fear most, is that the government will be heavy-handed when this Occupy movement is launched. And if that happens, then we may get more contention, and it could prove to be a problem. Where I think if it is handled with moderation, then Hong Kong people have had hundreds and hundreds of demonstrations over the many years I've been there. None of them have turned violent. So there's no reason for violence unless the government starts taking an aggressive approach.
You think there's a chance that the Chinese government would send in riot police as they do with all these protests in mainland China?
Well, there were
threats.
threats.
Would they go that far?
Right. There were threats. Some military generals, usually speaking off the cuff, talk about, well, if Hong Kong can't handle it, we'll send in the PLA. But the government itself has taken the view we can handle anything that goes on in Hong Kong. And Chinese leaders who are charged with making public policy statements have said that too, that they think Hong Kong police can handle any kind of demonstrations and so on. And one would hope that attitude prevails. But there are hotheads on the mainland who, they're also wanting to take over Japanese and Vietnamese occupied islands and so on. So there are hotheads who do want to, as Mao said, exercise power through the barrel of the gun.
That would be a big signal to the world, wouldn't it? If PLA came in there, it would change the landscape immediately.
Oh, it would change everything.
That would be the takeover of Hong Kong immediately.
Yeah.
It's not one country, two systems anymore.
Right. So I don't think, so far, I don't see any serious people talking about that. But there have been those threats put out there in the public debate, usually from more hardline leaders in China. So we don't know. We can hope that it won't go that far. But it is important, and I think you just made the point. It does connect with a lot of, all the questions about China's rise, because the world is watching how China uses power, because that has implications for us all.
And you title your article, "Who Will Stand Up for Hong Kong?" So what is your answer?
Well, quite frankly, the people that I see, I was writing that to provoke the British because they have a treaty. And I put that in there at the end that, you guys should at least speak up. Well, China doesn't want to listen to you, that's fine, but you do have some capacity. And John Major, at the time of these agreements, made very clear that if anything went wrong, Britain would mobilize international support to challenge any breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, where this white paper almost threw the Sino-British Joint Declaration in the trash can. And so where's the British voice? Well, on the day the white paper was published, and no accident, the Chinese premier was visiting London and meeting the Queen. And they reached a multi-million-dollar trade agreement. So this is what is the competition for standing up on issues like this. So what I really think who will stand up for Hong Kong are the people themselves on the street. That they are the people who are going to most assertively stand up for Hong Kong. But if things go wrong, I think the rest of the world may feel the need to speak up as well. Hopefully it won't get to that.
If the rest of the world feels like they have to speak up, it'll be limited to speaking, don't you
Right.
think? Nobody is
they're not going to.
Nobody is going to meddle with the meddlers.
Right. Right. No,
That would be sad.
Right.
Very
I don't
sad.
think the rest of the world, as we see in Ukraine and elsewhere, they're putting pressure on the Russians in Ukraine. They have the capacity to put pressure, usually through trade restrictions and so on, embargoes, on a country that's doing something, of this nature. But typically, they're not going to send in military forces to do things like that. So that issue is a little different when it comes to those islands in the South or East China Sea. There could well be U.S. military forces involved. In fact, the U.S. has promised to provide such forces vis-a-vis the Japanese claim. So, but when it comes to Hong Kong, I think it would have to be a kind of international pressure. But the pressure on China would not just be that. It would be people immigrating out of Hong Kong, all kinds of things, businesses leaving Hong Kong. I mean, there's that's the golden goose, or the goose that lays the golden egg. So China does have a big interest in Hong Kong.
Yeah, so much happens in Hong Kong.
Right. So hopefully they will be sensible in how they handle these matters.
Now, you're a public intellectual on this. You're out in public on this. You've
Well,
made your position very clear. You continue to make it clear. You're a voice, which has, there's a certain amount of risk to being public on anything, even here on ThinkTech.
Right.
But query, what happens if this starts to turn a little sour? What happens to a public intellectual then?
Well, there's a lot of public intellectuals. I'm probably the least of them in Hong Kong. A lot of colleagues in academia and very prominent journalists continuously and every day write critiques of what the government is doing, what China is doing, and even what the Occupy Central people are doing. And so I think these people will carry on. If China gets that heavy-handed that they can't carry on, then we can only guess what will happen. I suppose they'll leave if they have to. If their visas are withdrawn, or if they're locals, then they'll face the consequences. But so far, I don't think that's really the risk. I think that would be that's too imaginative at this point. China is much more clever. You know, the old days may have been just sending in the tanks. Today, they know how to manage the public debate in a lot of ways.
And manipulate it as well.
Right, exactly. So I don't see it in that sort of courageous terms, and I think people will continue to speak up.
Jiang, you know, it falls on the co-host to summarize the discussion. Maybe ask a last question if you wish, and close. Go for it.
I thought I did already ask the last question. This is a great session. We learned so much from you, and it's Taiwan, Hong Kong is definitely something we need to watch. I mean, we have Taiwan, and you know, the international influence of the Chinese government in the world in mind, and really to see in that way Hong Kong is kind of an experimental. A laboratory to see where the Chinese government would go, how far they would go, and hopefully they know that.
Yeah, I think they're very smart. I'd never underestimate them. And I hope they're smart enough to understand some of the things we're talking about today. Yeah. You know, sometimes they wait to the last minute. Just this weekend, they said it was not too late to find a compromise. The Chinese officials said that. First time I heard that out of them over these long months of debate.
Okay.
So, and this is the last minute because they're supposed to issue their decision at the end of this month.
Wow.
So, will something happen? And Democrats are now meeting with the Chinese leaders. The leaders of the democratic movement in Hong Kong have 4 meetings over the last week and this week. I hope somebody will seize the opportunity and reach a moderate compromise that conforms to these promises that were made long ago.
It's the last minute for them, and it's the last minute for us.
Right.
We're about out of time here. That's Michael C. Davis, scholar, a law professor, and public intellectual in Hong Kong. What an exciting time, no kidding. This is ThinkTech Asia. I'm here with Jiang, and we've been asking, should China be meddling in Hong Kong? And the answer is no. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Aloha.
Thank you.
Great to have you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. It's